Hello, I am Tu, and today we are going to discuss about what the fuck is going on. So, first Trump wanted to buy Greenland, now he's dealing with Venezuela's oil. Well, if this isn't multitasking, I don't know what is. Bro, relax. One country at a time. So Venezuela, population about 30 million, oil producer, produces around 1 million barrels a day. Consumption, negotiable. Actually, consumption is much lower than production. In older data, consumption was under 600 kbpd and most output was exported. So, what to remember? Big country, big oil potential, but small actual output and control. We all know the latest news. Trump invited the president of Venezuela for tea. Of course he went. Of course he wanted to. They talked, they bonded, they had a great time. Meanwhile, local media in Venezuela reported that 57 people were killed. Trump said, "I am pleased to announce that Venezuela's interim authorities will turn over to the United States between 30 and 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil. This oil will be sold at market prices. And the money will be controlled by me, the President of the United States, to ensure it benefits the people of Venezuela and the United States." Wow, what a saint. What a good man. Pure generosity. This is purely an act of kindness. Now let's see why the US is suddenly being so friendly to Venezuela. First reason, the US produces a lot of oil, but it consumes far more. Venezuela produces much less than it used to, and it consumes even less. This chart shows Venezuela's oil production versus consumption. Production collapsed after 2010, hitting a low around 2020. Since then, output has slowly recovered. Consumption, meanwhile, kept falling. The gap tells the story. Oil came back. The economy didn't. This chart compares oil production and consumption in Venezuela and the US. On the US side, production rises, but consumption stays much higher. On the Venezuela side, production collapses and only partially recovers. Consumption falls even faster. One country has a gap because it consumes too much. The other has a gap because its economy collapsed. Same product. Very different problems. This chart shows Venezuela's crude oil production over recent years. Production has grown through 2024 and into 2025, with monthly output often close to or above 900,000 barrels per day. Some data even show production reaching around 956,000 bpd in late 2025. That's a significant recovery compared with earlier years, but still far below the country's historical peak of over 3 million barrels per day before the long decline. What this tells us is that Venezuela has been rebuilding output, yet it remains constrained by investment, infrastructure, and geopolitical pressures. Second reason, Venezuelan crude isn't light and sweet. It's heavy and sulfur-rich. Heavy oil means it's denser and harder to process than light shale. And that matters because most US Gulf Coast refineries were built decades ago to handle exactly this kind of heavy crude. These refineries already have the complex equipment needed for heavy, high-sulfur oil, which makes Venezuelan barrels a very good fit. In fact, some US plants can displace more expensive imports if Venezuelan crude flows back in. So while US shale produces light oil, these Gulf Coast facilities specialize in heavy crude, and Venezuelan oil matches their design almost perfectly. Third reason, less dependence. Geopolitical control. Less dependence on the Middle East, fewer unstable shipping routes, fewer politically difficult suppliers. Venezuela is close, geographically and strategically. It is like the US backyard. So what about prices? 30 to 50 million barrels won't dramatically move the market because the world consumes around 100 million barrels of oil every single day. That means the immediate impact is mostly psychological, not a real supply shock. In the medium term, however, Things could change if Venezuela fully returns to the market, sanctions are lifted, and production continues to rise. In that case, global supply would increase, prices would face downward pressure, and OPEC Plus would lose some of its leverage. But everything ultimately depends on stability. Without a stable state and reliable institutions, the market won't trust the supply. And without trust, oil on paper doesn't become oil that moves prices. When a president treats authority as personal power rather than delegated responsibility, ignoring transparency, sidelining checks and balances, or deciding outcomes without consent, democratic legitimacy begins to erode. And when legitimacy erodes, it doesn't feel very stable, does it? Hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned. More coming soon.